Good morning. My name is Jeff Miller. I am with ForeFront Agronomy out of Plainview, Texas. And I'm going to visit with you today about water management strategies for corn in Texas in particular. And we're going to cover several different topics today as we work through this. First and foremost, talk about the upcoming weather pattern and hopefully be able to offset some of that weather with some particular strategies as it relates to irrigating corn. Talk through some soil health, because we feel like if we've got good soil health, we can offset some of the weather. And then we're going to talk into some of the technology that we're using to manage irrigation that we've been working on over the last couple of years. So hopefully, you'll get something good out of this. The encouraging thing with corn today is that we've got a pretty good price to work off of. And so if there's a way to work something like this crop into your rotation, I think it'd be, would be a great opportunity to take advantage of that. So we'll get started. So the first thing we wanted to just dive into is weather. And as many of you know, we've been in a very I don't know how else to put it, but a pretty dire situation really over the last couple of years, but especially, the back half of this past season from, about July and until now. We've just had very little rainfall to help us out. We've had a lot of heat and significant windstorms. We've had cool spells. We've had a little bit of everything. With the exception of any kind of moisture. And looks like, according to some of the weather services that we follow, that trend is probably going to continue on through the spring. And I know Brian Bledsoe is going to visit with you about that, but just kind of looking at some of the sources that we have, looks like we may have some opportunities around planting time to get a good planting rain. Then the spigot's going to shut off, the heat's going to come on as it normally does. And but then there may be some change in the patterns as we get to late summer, early fall. So kind of giving you some ideas on what we're dealing with there. And there's nothing that you can do about the weather, but we can work to offset what the weather is going to give us, or be able to optimize it whenever it takes, whenever it is favorable. And that's the way that I want you to look at that. There's not anything we can do about it, but we can make decisions to make adjustments. And growing a corn crop in West Texas is no different. It's about putting forth a good plan, getting started, and sticking to that plan, but being able to make adjustments as necessary. So I've shown this slide over the years, and just a reminder, about when our rainfall falls. And these are average numbers. These are this is data collected out of Hale County over the last 100 years, and just looking at most of our rainfall falls during the growing season. And typically we don't get a whole lot of moisture through the late fall and late winter months. It just doesn't normally happen. So we've got to depend on rainfall that falls during the growing season. We'd prefer it to fall like the averages say, but as we all know, that doesn't always happen either. But kind of giving you an idea where we're sitting, where we normally are, and some of those numbers that I showed previously are we above normal? Are we below normal? Are we average? To kind of give you an idea where we're going with that. The other thing we've got to consider is how effective is our rainfall. And I'd say this is probably pretty true for most of West Texas. If you look at the rainfall events that we have, the majority of them are going to be below a ½ inch. And it's funny, sitting at my barn in Plainview this year, we showed that we had 6.5 inches of moisture. And I think we had an 1.5 inches in March, and then we had whatever this 1.5 to 3 inches of snow and ice and those kind of things back late last year. And the rest of that came in heavy dews. and light amounts. And that's typically what we're looking at. On the other hand of things, we do get those big rains, but the problem is whenever they come hard and fast. And what are we able to do? How effective was that rainfall whenever it came? So I think there's some management practices that we need to be focusing on in this part of the world, especially as it relates to capturing moisture. And the best way to do that is to keep that ground covered. And the reason that I say that over a tillage pass is because of this pan evaporation that we experience. I mean, we are in the second highest area in the U.S., only behind Death Valley. And part of that is our elevation. Part of that is our terrain, and part of that's just flat out where we're located, latitude and longitude. But once again, one of those things that we can't change, but one of those things that with awareness we can make adjustments. And fortunately, we've been working with producers over the last 5 or 6 years, implementing some plans and putting together some systems that allow us to offset this evaporation. And really, it boils down to keeping our soil covered. We know out here it's windy, and like I said, we catch, especially coming off of a drought, typically those first couple of rainstorms can be pretty hard and heavy to get things broke loose. And we've got to be able to keep that ground held in place. And because we don't need to be losing nutrients, we don't need to be losing any more soil organic matter because we don't have much to lose in the first place. Anything that we can do to reduce those evaporation rates, putting it into the ground. Basically, the way that I look at it is water in the soil transpirates, water on the ground evaporates. And so anything that we can do to get it there. We were able to maintain a more moderate range of soil temps, and the fungi, the bacteria, all the living organisms in the soil function at an optimal temperature. And if it's too cold or if it's too hot, they're not going to be, they're not going to be able to do the things that they were designed to do, just like you and I. I don't do very well in cold temps, and I don't do very well in hot temps. I'd love it to be, 80 degrees out here all the time. The other thing that we can look into is whenever we keep the soil covered is we can start alleviating some of that compaction because of that surface compaction. Whenever water hits bare soil, it's weight and it holds on to it. And but having something there as a barrier ends up dissipating that energy and slowly releasing that water into the ground, and we don't see that surface compaction. Obviously, anything we can do to suppress weed growth is a plus, not only from an input standpoint, but just from a competition standpoint. And then, ultimately, just given our natural ability of the soil to make nutrients, to hold water, to grow plants, give it the best opportunity to do that. The other thing that we want to focus on as it relates to water, especially, is minimizing that soil disturbance. And really what we find is, especially on physical disturbance, so tillage, we end up restricting infiltration of water because we've destroyed those biological glues that hold our soil together. And, I'm not going to say that we don't need to ever plow, but we need to be smart with how we plow. Does every acre need it? Probably not. I think there can be some prescription tillage, and even utilizing different tillage practices. I'm not a big fan of the disc. It ends up doing a lot more anything with a disc on it. I'd rather run a shank, a deep shank, some things like that to break things up, or a shallow sweep to take care of weeds, and that be it. But it boils down to anything that we can do to reduce the amount of erosion from water, wind, keeping that water from ponding, keeping it from crusting, and soil organic matter depletion. As I mentioned earlier, we've been able to work with guys putting together some systems to help improve their soil health, and really we've we focused on energizing the system with diversity and really looking at the multiple different species. And you're going to see lots of things from all parts of the world, and guys doing some crazy things with 30-way mixes and stuff like that. And I don't think it has to be that complicated. We focus by utilizing species that are adapted to this part of the world. We're always experimenting with new and exciting things, but really, kind of the base of this is, getting a good mixture of a legume, a grass, brassicas, and broadleaves to be able to put that, that system together so that you've got a lot of synergism between the different species and what they're able to bring. And then finally, we want to maximize those living roots. And really the basic of this is you've got a root that is living out there in the soil, and it is, we're capturing sunlight, we're creating photosynthesis, we're creating root exudates that feed the biology. The biology then releases nutrients back to the plants that we end up utilizing for, the crop and things like that. And yes, you are going to use moisture, but there's smart ways to go about implementing a plan like this, and really in this environment, anything that we can do to get grown into the fall and then let it winter kill and carry us through into the spring is probably the best or most preferred method. But there's ways to make winter grains work as well, that grow through the winter. It's just being smart with how we terminate those and how we get to the end. So let's dig into the principles of irrigation scheduling. And one that's going to manage water needs to understand the moisture holding capacity of their soils. And even more importantly is the moisture holding capacity of different parts of the field. And, as a general rule, we see silt loams that are holding about 2 inches per foot, sandy loams holding about 1.5 inches per foot, and sands holding 1 inch per foot as a general rule. Now, there's a lot of difference in between those. But most of the soils that I work in this general area are silt loams and sandy loams, and so understanding that that's how much water they can hold. We also need to know how much water is available out of that as well. Thinking about this, plants can extract about 70% of the water from the soil. Permanent wilting point happens when we hit that 70% extraction, because the rest of that water is being held to the soil and it's too tight to pull off of that colloid. And so really, as we manage irrigation, we tend to stay in that 25 to 50% depletion level so that we know that we've got some in reserve if it takes a few extra days to get around. But as we dry that soil down, it gets harder and harder to extract. And understanding this and knowing what soil water holding capacities that we have available can help us schedule those irrigations, because on certain soil types we may be putting out heavier, slower amounts, and on other soil types we may put out lighter and more frequent trips. And it really boils down to how we go about that, and truly understanding it. And there's lots of technology out there available today, from our eyes and boots in the ground and a soil probe to multiple different sensors that are able to help capture that information. And I will caution you as you look at some of this technology, the sensors are great, but it's really about what are you doing to verify that data? Do you have people going back out ground truth and pulling samples, doing those kind of things to truly understand that? And so making sure that you pick the right partner to be able to do that. Another thing that we've got to be able to pay attention to is how much can we actually put out, and what other crops are we sharing with, or what are we looking at? And so I know that this doesn't cover everyone, but looking at just a general rule, how much water do we have available through irrigation, and how much of that's going to come out in a daily rate, and how much of that's going to come out in a weekly rate. And you've got the ability sitting right there in your panel to be able to figure some of these things out. And but being smart with how we're able to apply that water, and be realistic. you know if we got a 300-gallon pivot out there, we're not going to be able to put out 2 inches a week on the entire circle. We're going to have to do something different, or you're going to have to make some tough decisions on which crop to keep and which one to let suffer for a little bit. As we talk about that, what is that, especially as it relates to corn, it's truly, a function of water out here in this part of the world. And what can we do? Can we set realistic expectations with the amount of water that we have? And so what I did is I pulled together some data that some of my counterparts on the North Plains have helped put together, and looked at a dry year, an average year, and a wet year. And fortunately, we saw those kind of fall in place back earlier in this decade. And looking at a guy that's got 4 gallons a minute, we should be able to hit somewhere in that 160 to 180 bushels. And but if we don't get any supplemental rainfall, it's going to be below that. If we get average rainfall, we're probably going to be hitting there. And if we catch rains at the right time during the growing season, we could be above that. And really, that's kind of the trend all the way through the through the case. But there's also this point, whenever we get up in that 5.5 to 6 gallons a minute, that we really don't need any more water than that. And so, working through putting your plans together, understanding what the weather's going to do, understanding what capabilities you actually have, is going to help us make an irrigation plan. There's multiple ways to determine soil moisture. One of them is a hand feel method, and we've used this one for a long time. Go out, pull a soil core feel of it, understand what soil type that you've got. You can determine how much moisture you've got available in that core, and be able to determine, when do we need to irrigate. Probably one of the best things about this is that you've got your boots in the ground and you're able to make observations. You can pull as many cores as you feel necessary, but time is of the essence, and you've got to get across those acres. And really, it's one data point per per field, per visit. A soil penetrometer we've found gives you a general idea of that you've got at least a little bit of moisture in the ground, and really it helps us understand at what depth. Basically you're sticking a rod in the ground, and do we have a 4-foot profile, 3-foot profile, whatever that may be. And you'll find later on in our presentation that where that comes into play. And then, capacitance probes have been used out here for a number of years. That's our preferred method, because, we're able to go out, we're able to place these on that majority acre in the field that we're going to manage. And you've got a constant, you're sampling the exact same spot, multiple times a day, every 15 minutes. You got 9 sensors, you got 3 different readings. We're looking at probably nearly 1,700 data points a day, and you've got access to that 24/7 with the inclusion of the telemetry. And so, are any of these perfect? No, but they give you an indicator of where you're at, and with proper planning could give you an idea where you're going to be. And we can also track and see, okay, how much, have we improved our situation? Have we decreased our situation? Are we maintaining? What are we able to do? And it just helps you make better decisions. So I've shown this slide multiple times, and really it's true to any crop. As a crop emerges and starts growing, it's really kind of like a human life. At that point, it's not using much water, not using much nutrients, not taking up much space, but you've kind of got to baby that thing along and make sure that everything is in place. And so, looking at what we want to do. And so the idea behind a corn crop is to get our roots as deep as possible, as early as possible. But in doing so, that doesn't mean that we go pour a ton of water on that crop. What that means is managing those irrigations, scheduling them correctly early in the season to not only give them what they need, but make them want to go deeper. What I've found a lot of times with irrigations that we've gone out and we've just saturated the ground early in the season when that's young. Number one, you're prone to evaporation. Number two is that you've told that plant that everything's going to be hunky dory, and knowing good and well that whenever July and August hit, it's not going to be hunky dory. And so we've got to get those roots down where they need to go. And so, basically how this is set up is, we're looking at the roots below the line, the top growth above the line. And then these graphs are going to pop up along here, and it's really looking at where those roots are getting active. And so, as we look at, early in the growth stage, we don't have roots very deep. And really, on a corn plant, if you've got a foot tall corn plant, you should have roots that are about a foot deep. As we move through the growing season, those roots are going to naturally go after water. They're going after gravity. As that plant grows above ground, it's growing below ground, and we're adding depth to it. And like I said, whenever we get to those critical time periods, we want those roots tapped into as much soil water reserves as possible, because we are not going to have the amount of irrigation needed to apply. At some point, our demand is going to exceed what we can apply, and so we've got to depend on things stored in the soil. Now, what a lot of people have struggled with is that, well, we'll build a profile here early in the growing season, but think about it. That plant may not be using much, but it is using something. Whether it's 1/10 of an inch a day or whatever, you've got evaporation, maybe another 1/4 inch. All of a sudden that 1 inch application turns into 6 or 7 tenths. And that goes on every day. And so, really, if there's any way that we could start with a profile, that would be much better and easier to manage that irrigation. But the good thing is, if you're able to monitor that, you're able to understand, okay, where are our roots at? Can we manipulate that? And can we move it through the growing season? But really taking care of that crop, especially as it approaches the reproductive stage, because that's where your peak demand is going to be happening. So let's go through a couple of strategies. And, this one has been contested for as long as I've been out here. Should we pre-water? Should we not? And I will tell you today that if you're going to grow corn, you do need to put some water in the ground prior to planting. And it is desirable to have at least a 4-foot profile at planting on fields with less than 5 gallons a minute, which would cover most of us. This is, back to that point. Let's bank some subsoil moisture to get that corn to that peak water use. And this is where I love the impact of those, something to keep that ground covered. Because if we're applying irrigation water on bare ground, we're opening ourselves up for evaporation. We're probably not infiltrating that water correctly, versus, especially in a pre-watering scenario, if we've got some residue out there to help us infiltrate that water and to protect it from evaporation, we're putting it where it belongs so that it can be transpirated through the plant. If you can't pre-water for some reason, or you didn't get around to it quick enough, we're just going to have to start irrigating earlier, but that doesn't mean heavier. Looking at the opportunity for that crop to make it or break it, really your main opportunity for managing stress is that early vegetative stage. And I'd say, from the time that it is up to a good stand until about that V8, V9 stage, you can hurt that corn pretty good with very minimal yield loss. As we go from late vegetative into tassel emergence, that is we're starting to get into that critical time period, and those, that percent yield loss can go much higher. As we go into, from tassel on into early ear development, this is the most critical time that you've got to have the ability to provide supplemental irrigation. Hopefully you've got a profile that's able to release some water, and let's pray for some rain. As we get through that crop stage, things kind of come down. We get past the dough stage, we get back into these 5 to 10%. So basically the front side and the back side are the only opportunities that you have to truly manage that water. So moving through the growing season, as we move from planting to V6, the first thing is get it planted, put it into good moisture, and then turn the pivot on if you've got the ability to. Typically, we recommend applying between a 3/4 and an inch of irrigation, and to give that a good proper seed bed to work with, and ensure proper germination and a good even emergence. Typically, I don't have much of an issue with crust on corn, but if you're worried about it, just some quick 1/4 to 1/2 inch passes to kind of soften up that crust can help. Once again, back to keeping that ground covered. We don't have much of an issue with crust. As we get into these hot, dry springs, it may require another pass of irrigation after it's fully emerged to get us to that, first leaf, and has been a very good practice. If we've got good subsoil moisture and a fairly favorable spring, many guys will shut off for roughly the next 30 days and let that crop root down and do what it needs to do. But where we have lower irrigation capacities, we got a hot, dry spring, we're going to probably have to crank up that irrigation system earlier than normal, and probably somewhere in that V4 time frame would it just kind of depends. The other thing to keep in mind is as we get towards the end of that, we are developing that root or developing that ear in that V5 to V7 stage, but we're also shooting out the next round of roots. And, it's really kind of interesting as we got our lay-by applications that we can put on. We've got critical time stages. This is a good time to think about cranking up water, especially if it's hot and dry and we're starting to get pretty high soil temps, to be able to to help with that rooting development by moistening up that piece. As we go through the growing season, really from V6 all the way till through those critical growth stages, basically it's do everything that you can to keep this crop moving along. Pay attention to what that corn is using per day. What's our projected forecast? Where's our soil moisture? And really the only adjustments that can be made during the season is to rate and timing. Do we need to speed it up? Do we need to slow it down? And then if we are fortunate enough to catch a rain, do we, is it enough to warrant shutting down? And if it is, when do we start back up? At less than 5 gallons a minute, we need to be running these pivots as slow as possible without running water off. Typically that's going to be 1 inch to 1.25 inches on sand, and then 1.5 inches to 2 inches on tighter ground such as our silty clay loams. As we approach the end of the season, as that plant's starting to work towards dry down, keep in mind that corn uses water until black layer. Until it sets a black layer, it is going to use water. Now, depending on the crop stage, it's not going to use a whole lot. We've got a nice picture here, looking at where that starch line is. Roughly it's going to take you about 4.5 inches of water to go from that point till black layer. As we move through 30, 40, 50% starch line, we're down to a couple of inches. And as we get towards, 3/4 milk line or starch line, where, you've got 1 inch. And so really just kind of understanding that development as we move through the end of the season, first and foremost, we don't want to deplete the upper 3 foot of the profile more than 50%. And This is very critical, and as we approach the end of the season, um, a lot of times when we determine soil moisture and when to shut water off, we like to target that 50% starch line. If you've got a 3 to 4 foot profile, you should have enough moisture in the ground to carry you through to the end of the season, depending on your soil types. Sandier soils, we probably want to run that thing one more time, but look at the forecast. If it's going to be hot, dry, and windy, we probably need to make, we're going to need to adjust that strategy and make at least one more pass after 50% starch line, or possibly two. And I know guys hate these. They're tired of running these pivots. They're tired of doing things, but it will truly pay off at the end of the day. And that doesn't mean that you got to go out there and put 2 inches on. It may, let's make adjustments. As you're looking at corn silage, we need a 3-foot profile at full dent. So, basically right here at that 10% starch line, or at that 25% starch line, we need a 3-foot profile to carry us on. Same thing. Look at the forecast over the next 10 days. Is it going to be hot, dry, and windy? Then we need to probably, extend that one more pass. And if it's going to be cool and wet, then you can probably pull it off a little bit earlier. So, you ask yourself, well, how can we manage some of these things? And this is where some of the technology comes into play. And, just thinking about, your pivot speed. The main thing to consider is that each revolution, if you're putting water on the ground, you're also seeing evaporation. It's all going to depend on the weather, crop stage, canopy closure, your tillage practices, but we are still going to see some evaporation. In West Texas, on clean tilled ground, evaporation is going to account for 1/4 to 1/2 inch of each irrigation pass, especially early in the growing season. Anything that you can do to get that, water falling less, less distance, getting it closer to the ground, is going to be better than running sprays and things like that. Main thing is run as slow as you can and start as early as you can, in that V6 to V8 stage. Run as slow as you possibly can to fill the top 2 to 3 feet to fill capacity. Is going to be a best management practice in hot years. 1 inch to 1.25 inches on sand in up to 7 days, and 1.5 inches to 2 inches on tighter ground in up to 12 days has been very effective as we go into dry summers. So looking at some of the technology as it relates to pivot speed, there is the ability to variably apply water, and really, if you've got a pivot, you've got the ability, and you probably have the need. And really, looking at it from all different angles, taking care of that wind, that extra wind stress that's going to happen on the southwest edge of the field. Maybe it's a slightly different soil type. Maybe it's a different crop that you're managing. There's lots of ways to look at a variable rate irrigation application into the field, but there's definitely ways to look at this. And so we've been doing some studies over the years, and just looking at where does this come into play. It really, the opportunity lies within soil texture and topography, because these are unchanging variables. They're going to be the same from year to year, unless you go out there with a big caterpillar and tear everything up. But this is that God-given variable that you've got to work around. You've got to either offset or you got to optimize, and being able to to make every part of that field perform to its potential. The unfortunate thing is that some things have less potential. Some parts of the field have less potential than other parts of the field. And so in many cases, we may be over applying in this low potential area, and we may be under applying in a high potential area. And so, with how we go about, building these plans. So what we've got here is a soil variability map, and being able to develop a variable rate irrigation prescription where we would use speed control. So we're going to speed up or we're going to slow down the pivot. And in doing that, that's going to affect our application rates in those parts of the field. But with understanding soil type, soil texture, soil topography, and water holding capacities, and there's multiple ways to gather this information, we've been able to put together a very nice variable irrigation plan for that field. And really what the ultimate goal is to take the peaks and valleys out of that field and be able to, have a more consistently yielding field of corn or cotton or whatever that we're looking at. But sometimes that map is not going to look like that. This is an ideal situation, but sometimes, like I said, we may have spots in the field that are just not going to make it. And so why are we putting all the seed, all the fertilizer, and all the water that the rest of the field is doing? But on the other hand, we may have half the field over here that we are under applying things to. And so it's really kind of putting your inputs where they belong and optimizing them. And so, just looking at the data here, as we look at, different soil textures, as that texture got heavier, more clay content in it, more water holding capacity, our yields went up. As we looked at landscape changes, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between, the first three, but as we started getting into those lower spots, we saw a reduction in yield, and more than likely that's because water was collecting there and sitting there. And I said, honestly, I see that out here, even on flat ground. You'll walk out. I said, you want to know why your corn's wavy? It's because you're either water shedding or you're water collecting, and it may be, it may be the size of a pickup. But I said that's where that's the difference, and literally a tenth of an inch can be a big difference at the wrong time. So, really it's about putting the right amount of water in the right place. And this is some work that we've done. And so looking at these zones across a field, this was that last field, and really, very happy with the results that we saw here, very high yields. What you see in the boxes below the yield is the amount of water that was applied. And so, different zones, these are more sandier hillsides. These are more low spots, heavier soils is how I would describe the color differences. But very respectable yields. But let me look at this. So, our highest yield on this whole field was 304.84 with 9/10 of an inch applied to every pass versus, 300 bushels with our highest amount of 1.11 inches. And so let me tell you this, more water does not always equal more yield. Not always. So what we're all about is optimizing that growth system to give you more yield in all areas of the field. And, there's lots of factors that affect this, planning, your seed population, your fertility plans, compaction, soil texture, weather. I mean, there's just so many, there's 1,000 different variables that you've got to look at. And so anything that we can do to take a couple of those variables away is going to lead you to success. And if we can do that in multiple parts in the field, that success rate's even higher. Many guys have windshield wiper pivots, especially, there's not a lot of full circle pivots anymore around here. And so, there is a challenge with managing those, and you can do that with variable rate irrigation too. And it really just boils down to adjusting now that speed, instead of overwatering the ends where you're turning around all the time and running back. We've got the ability to do that, and instead of running back across the alternate crop on the other side of the pivot at at 10%, or at 100%, burning gearboxes up, maybe this is a better way. And we've had pretty good luck doing this and smoothing that out and reducing the amount of pivots that get stuck. The other thing we want to focus on is keeping a healthy soil moisture nutrient profile. And so just another place where technology can help us understand. This is a field of corn that we were monitoring this year, and really very happy with how things were moving along. But as we got there towards the middle of July, this producer was fortunate enough to get a pretty good sized rainfall event, and we had just irrigated. We just put on some nitrogen through the pivot. And what we noticed is you'll notice down here at the 36-inch sensor that we've got water that has moved down there. And with water, typically your nitrogen goes with you too. And if you'll notice, we don't have a lot of rooting activity down there. We've got a little bit, but not enough to warrant pushing that nitrogen past the root zone. And so being able to adjust those irrigation amounts after that event to take advantage of what we've got, and unfortunately had to add a little bit more nitrogen to put it where it needed to be. This is looking at the bottom two sensors of where that nitrogen was going, and we were starting to deplete that nitrogen down in that 32 and 36-inch range until that rainfall event fell, and we ended up pushing it on past. And so we had to make some adjustments with our irrigation patterns and to go and be able to mine that back down to where it needed to be. So being able to use that technology, some other best management practices, if you've got regulators, those things do have a lifespan. And, they say somewhere between 5 and 7 years, probably going to be on the low side if you're pumping any sand. So keep that in mind. I put this showed up on Twitter a couple of years ago, but understanding what your pressures mean, because that reduced pressure is going to cause erratic watering patterns. And I liked how they looked at that. 20 to 30 you got great corn, 10 to 15 okay corn, and anything below that your corn is not going to be good at all. And so being able to pay attention to that, there's also other technology that's really come leaps and bounds the last couple of years, and that's aerial and satellite imagery. And one of the things that they can help you do is pick up those application problems probably before your eyes are ever going to see it. And all kinds of other things, nozzle stoppage, pressure problems, being able to understand, are we overwatering in an area, underwatering in an area, those kind of things. If guys are going to split plant 2 corn crops, it is best to, and even just split plant between other crops, it's best to spread that peak water use out 30 to 45 days between crops. And so, looking at the crops that you're going to grow, that will affect the planting dates that you need to be paying attention to. And, looking at this year, I think that it's going to be very important that we, manage our plant populations from the get-go, and probably on the lower end of things. Maybe shortening up that maturity to be able to take advantage of what we've got available. And do we plant early or do we plant late? And some other things that I don't have in there would be planting depth. As we reduce the amount of water, I feel like we need to probably be sticking that plant in just slightly deeper, just to make sure that we've got good root development. So kind of finishing out, just looking at some different things here, different scenarios that I've run. Here's kind of 3 scenarios where we're running this an inch at a time, an inch and a quarter at a time, and an inch and a half at a time. Thinking about that, to put on the same amount of water, it's going to take 19 irrigation events versus 16 irrigation events over here. So what is that going to cost you in electricity? What's that going to cost you in maintenance? And the other thing is looking at what are opportunities for scheduling that irrigation, especially early in the growing season, what that needs to look like. And really, really what this boils down to is the same amount of irrigation. It's just doing it differently. and being able to put that on. The next thing is looking at your planting dates. So what we've got here is scenarios from late March all the way till early June. And by manipulating these different planting dates, you've got the ability to adjust your irrigation amounts. And really, it just goes back to those early slides that we talked about when that irrigation falls, being able to time up when those typically happen during the growing season. And so planting early, we're going to need slightly more irrigation than we would if we were to push this thing all the way into June. So just something to keep in mind. There are some ways to play around with this. And finally, looking at those different maturities, as we look at some short season maturities, 100-day all the way up to full season maturities, 117 days. The reason that those things are short is because they don't have as many leaves that they've got to push out. And, really from the time that it tassels till the time that it finishes up is going to be the same amount of time. But in that, from planting till tassel, we've got the ability to save some irrigations there. But typically, as we shorten up our maturities, we also shorten up our yield potential. So just something to keep in mind. So with that, I've enjoyed our time together. Would be glad to visit with any of you offline, putting together corn management strategies as Good morning.